It's Wednesday, October 21st, 2020, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our socially distant weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from various locations within the Missouri School of Journalism. I'm in the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute, and my colleagues Kathy Kiely and Ernest Perry are joining me via Skype. Let's check in with them now. Ernest, hi.
How you doing?
Okay, and Kathy, good to see you here too today. On our program this week, new rules from the Commission on Presidential Debates that could make tomorrow night's event in Nashville a little different than what we saw in that first debate a few weeks back. The Justice Department sued Google yesterday in a case that could have widespread legal implications for Google and others in the tech industry.
Welcome home, Mr. President. Thank you. What I missed?
Oh, you missed a lot, President Bartlett. It's been a lot, and it's a pretty big week for politically minded releases on streaming services. We're going to talk about what the three of us have watched and what's still ahead between now and Election Day. There's a lot more that we're going to talk about too before our half hour is up. But I want to start with a story we had planned on talking about last week and had to cut for time. And that's the story of Ashley Spinks. Until the middle of last week, she was the one and only editorial staffer at the Floyd Press in Southern Virginia. You might have noticed my use of the past tense there, and that's because the paper's owner, Lee Enterprises, fired her after WVTF, Virginia's public radio, ran a profile on her. In it, she explained how working at the paper had changed since Lee Enterprises bought it back in March, and how the staff was decimated, how freelance budgets were slashed, and how Lee cut and cut and cut until she was the only one left. And then Kathy, she was fired less than 24 hours before she was supposed to send that paper to print, again, by herself. Talk about what's happened in the days since that happened.
Well, I think Ashley has become a folk hero, I think, for journalists. And I think it was you who told me that she's gotten all kinds of Venmo contributions for her upcoming wedding. Yeah. So not only was she was fired right before her wedding day. So, this is an old story, but I think it's actually an important one for people who are outside the business to understand, because this is really a problem not just for journalists. It is a problem of civic society. What are we going to do in a digital era when many of the sources of income that have supported journalism for certainly all the 20th century have now dried up? And you have companies like Lee Enterprises that are large chains that are buying these organizations for reasons that are increasingly mysterious to me. It looks like all they want to do is liquidate the intellectual assets and the personnel assets, and then maybe sell off the real estate. Why would you own a news organization if you don't want to cover the news? And I think increasingly this is resulting in local communities losing important sources of information like Ashley Spinks.
Well, and we were talking about this a little bit even before the program, and what publications we subscribe to and what some of, the spending power of every one of those dollars. And Ernest, talk for a little bit about what this means when companies like Lee, which we've even seen here in Missouri with its ownership of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, comes in and brings with it that do more with less mentality.
Well, it's gotten even past the whole do more with less mentality. I think it goes directly to what Kathy was talking about, which is they're looking at the assets of the company in terms of what are their tangible assets. And most of the time it is the real estate. And what the biggest cost is in any business is usually labor. And so that's one of the first things that they pretty much start cutting when they come in. And they will cut and cut and cut to the point where, they're operating on a shoestring if they're operating at all. And then they begin to start looking at, well, how can we maximize profit or bring in more profit? And if they can't bring in the profit, then that's when they really start looking at, okay, how can we sell off some of these assets in order to keep keep our stock prices up and to keep our investors happy. And usually the people who lose out in that are the employees and those who are utilizing that news and information, i.e. the public. I mean, they really lose out on this.
So if you are Ashley Spinks, or today using the byline she is using in other places and those that have offered her freelance opportunities, Ashley Spinks Dugan, congratulations and best wishes to her. How does this come across after she talks about this experience and gets fired? How does it come across as anything other than retaliation?
I don't think it comes across as anything but retaliation. I think, the company clearly doesn't like to have its business tactics exposed, and I think with good reason. I think for people who are not in the journalism business, I think the message you take away is that shoe leather reporting isn't valued by the companies that are owning the news organizations in your communities. The people who are going out and actually trying to talk to people and find out what's going on, they're not valued. And that is a very dangerous thing for our entire society, because it means that legacy providers of journalism are increasingly being silenced, and the vacuum is being filled by propagandists and by people on social media who do not have the best interests of the community at heart.
So let's talk about that for a second. Earnest, the New York Times had a huge piece about this on Sunday, looking at entire networks of news organizations that are popping up across the country. But these aren't what you or I would consider to be reputable or reliable organizations. Tell our audience a little bit about these pay-for-play networks that are popping up across the country.
So basically, you have I would call them political entrepreneurs and propagandists, as Kathy pointed out, who are looking at this vacuum that's being created when the local news operations go out of business. They are basically hiring people doing pretty much piecemeal news stories. And then they take the information that these people put together and then they bring it in and they edit it and they add additional information, which is more propaganda than actual factual news. And then they put it out there. And when someone's reading it, it comes in under the guise of what a mainstream news operation would look like, in particular online. Their websites look familiar. They have the city's name. They could be the Akron Bee or the Akron Tribune, or come up with the name. But all of the news and information that's in there is slanted toward a particular political ideology. And a lot of it is the New York Times story centered around a Republican operative who was basically created this network in all 50 states. And he's operating it as if it is mainstream, and it sort of looks that way. But you also have the same thing on the liberal side. It's not as big or as centralized as this operation. But basically what's happening is that they're taking the place of the local news operations in these towns, but with the news and information that people are getting from them is more slanted toward a particular political event. And it doesn't give you that factual news about what's happening at city council. What are they really voting on? And in these times, what are the actual COVID numbers saying? What are the hospitalizations? What's actually happening on the ground? That news is getting lost. That news is not there. So this is something I think that people need to be aware of and need to make sure that they understand that this is not what you would call traditional news and traditional journalism.
So some of these, Kathy, have on their About page say where the funding for those sites are coming from. In some cases, that's because there have been questions about it, that there are some states that say that it must be transparent about labeling paid content. What advice would you offer maybe to people who might be picking up a device and seeing something that's either been shared on social media or something that they may be served up in an ad somewhere that could be coming from one of these sites? How to detect if it isn't fully transparent what the funding sources might be?
Well, one of the things that I always tell people is look for the About page. and see if that page links to something that's a website. And does that About page have names of people and telephone numbers and addresses that you can contact? If they don't, that's a red flag. There's also another great site called whois.com, which is kind of a white pages for the internet. You can plug the URL of the website, which you should have a website. If it doesn't have a website, I'd be suspicious. But you can plug that in and get, you should be able to get a lot of information. If the Whois response comes back with a lot of redacted for privacy, I'd be suspicious. If you enter the URL columbiamissourian.com into the Whois, you will get names, phone numbers, addresses. If you can't get that information, I'd be really suspicious, because it says somebody who's giving you this information doesn't want you to know who they are. And that it's that kind of digging, I think, that will reveal the red flags.
And what they're counting on is that people aren't taking the time to do exactly what Kathy is saying, that they're getting this information and pretty much just running with it. What they're also counting on is that one person gets it and they share it with someone else, either through their Twitter feed or through their Facebook page. And that way, they're getting the story, but they're not really seeing the entire news page there and the news operation. And then they just move on from story to story to story. So this is how this sort of perpetuates itself. And it actually, being able to do that actually works to the advantage of these operations.
And that's part that concern. Go ahead, Kathy. I'm sorry.
Can I give a little plug?
Yeah, please do.
Because,
for me?
Yes.
Go ahead. I'm not gonna tell you no there.
What you're doing at the J School and at the University of Missouri is really what we should be doing everywhere. You are taking some of the lessons that we teach in the newsroom, and you're putting them out there for the more general student body by teaching some of these skills. I think in a digital age, when we have indeed gotten rid of the gatekeepers, we all need to learn how to be our own gatekeepers. So a little bit of journalism 101, some of the critical thinking skills and the sleuthing skills that we teach to journalists, now everybody needs some of those skills. It's really part of your toolkit as a citizen.
Well, and thank you. And I appreciate that. One of the things that I find most alarming in the descriptions of what was found in this New York Times investigation is that it provided, for example, the hotelier who went ahead and literally ordered stories that followed a narrative that he needed to benefit his business. And the idea that he went to these companies that are running these sites and said, please write this story. He literally paid them to write the story and make it look like legitimate news, like the work that we do here at our newsrooms, like you see from newsrooms that you follow every day. That to me, even doing the ICANN search or trying to read through the About Us, it's still not transparent enough what the motivations are behind some of the stories that are written and who's pulling the strings there to get that content out there. That perhaps the news values that we talked about so much last week when we talked about some of the things going on in Denver, they're not being weighed as opposed to who has the money and who's waving it around.
Well, when you talk about values, the values here are how can we either promote our particular agenda or how can we generate profit from this? And I think that's basically the two things that they're going after. They're not really concerned about whether or not they're providing accurate news and information for people to be able to use and utilize. They're more interested in, how can I push my political agenda or how can I make a buck?
So
and
go ahead.
There's an example of this in Richmond, California, out in the Bay Area, where there's a newspaper that's paid for by Chevron. And guess what? It doesn't publish a whole lot of critical things about the refinery there. So I think the answer to that is real journalism. What the New York Times did exposing this is really important. We just have to hope there are enough local journalists left to do that at a local level.
Well, so it's not a big surprise with so much focus on making money and the bottom line at big chains, companies we're talking about, at sites such as this, that sometimes playing fast and loose while trying to fill gaps in news deserts, that type of thing has a lot of big J journalists among us looking for new places to practice their craft, places where making a buck isn't the goal as much as being detectives for the people. Those are the exact words that Jason Hancock used yesterday in his introduction of Missouri's newest news nonprofit, the Missouri Independent. Kathy, the Independent is the newest in the state's newsroom network. It's covering our state government down in Jeff City. We've been talking about funding sources and how we know we can trust, forgive me, the independence of reporting. It's a nonprofit. Who are the backers here? Tell us more about them, Kathy.
Well, it's a hodgepodge of people. It looks to me like a little more tilted to the left, but there looks to be, I think, if I remember correctly, some maybe some union-connected money there. But it's kind of all over the map, and they do list their donors. I would say my only complaint with the Independent is they don't give affiliations for the donors, or they didn't when I last looked. There's a lot of names, but then you have to go digging to find out what those names are connected with. But at least they're listing names. They do provide that information. I will say this. There is no such thing as conflict-free journalism. If you're working for the old-fashioned newspapers of yore, where I started my career, you had to worry about your advertisers. Were you going to write that mean story about the used car dealer who buys multiple pages of ads every Sunday? So there's no such thing as conflict-free journalism. The question is how transparent you are about it and what you do when that conflict happens. All of us as journalists have to be willing to bite the hand that feeds us. And sometimes that means consequences. But so I think as long as an organization is transparent, that is as much as we can ask. Money always has attachments.
Okay. Ernest, there's a staff of 4 people, and there's some names to those of us here in the Columbia area that are very familiar. Tell us about Jason Hancock, Rudy Keller, Rebecca Rivas, and Tessa Weinberg.
Well, what you have there are seasoned journalists who come from news operations around the state. They've covered the Capitol before. These are names that people who read the newspapers, both locally here in Columbia and statewide, say in St. Louis, Kansas City. They would recognize these names. So that gives this operation some credibility. This reminds me a lot of when the Texas Tribune started in Austin, which is now huge. It gets a lot of its funding from individuals as well as from foundations, and it has built a solid network. I mean, I think Kathy brought up a good point. If they can be transparent, and if they can cover the stories regardless of whether the story does say some sort of harm to the left or to the right, if they can do this operation that way and stick with it,
yeah.
I think that they can stand a chance. I mean, that's one of the things that we found is when you have these independent operations that are being funded from either individuals or foundations or both, it's a lot of it is about staying power. And if you can have that sustainability and be able to build a brand that is transparent and, shall we say, fair and accurate to all sides, then you stand a chance at being able to really make it.
Well, and we should be transparent too, and also mention that Rudy Keller, who was at the Columbia Daily Tribune previously, does do some adjunct teaching for us. Tessa Weinberg is one of our former students, somebody I would consider a mentee and a friend. And for people who may not know Tessa or remember Tessa from her time at the Columbia Missourian, you probably do remember her work. She was one of the first reporters to really report on former Governor Eric Greitens' use of social media and how he was among those that was blocking shocking constituents on social media when they were critical of him or asked questions. Kathy, one thing I noticed on the Independent's website, on each of their stories, there is a notification that they are being published under a Creative Commons license, that they are allowing other publishers to reuse their content with attribution and with allowances for editing for local style. Talk for a minute about this decision and how it signals kind of a different approach than what you typically see with copyright.
Yeah, I think this is a very, it's an acknowledgement of the new reality of the journalism business, which is we need to be collaborative. And what they're doing, Creative Commons, for those who don't know, is an alternative to copyright. And it basically is a way that you, as a content creator, can signal it's okay to reuse my work. There are various levels of Creative Commons licenses, and so you can kind of designate how much of your work you want used, whether or not somebody can change it, whether they can use it for commercial reasons. But what the Independent is doing here is really kind of giving to the greater good. They're saying we're about serving the community, and we want other newspapers to use our work, and news outlets, I would say more broadly. And so I think it's really important. It's an acknowledgement that journalism is a public service and a public good, and it should be shared.
Okay. Well, ask the federal government, and 90% of all internet search queries in the United States are done using Google. The Justice Department filed a lawsuit yesterday claiming that Google gained, quote, a grip on distribution by paying billions of dollars to become the default search application in web browsers, on smartphones, and other devices, including those offered by competitors such as Apple. Now, Google says that consumers have a wide array of choices and that consumers could end up using Microsoft's Bing, or that the iPhone and iPad are alternatives to Android devices. Earnest, let's focus on search, though. Google is likely to argue there's no harm to the user since they're not charging the public to use the search tool. Your response to that?
Well, it's for those of us who remember, I think that was the same argument that AT&T used back when when we had the breakup of the Bell system. So it's going to be interesting to see whether or not the government is going to go after Google with the same sort of zeal that it did when it went after the mighty phone company or other conglomerates like this. I think Google's going to try to stick to its argument to say that others can get in, but they just have not been able to do so to the extent that they've been able to corner the market. It's also going to be interesting to see what happens overseas, because you have similar sorts of initiatives going on in the EU and in other places against Google. So if all of that is brought in, it could lead to Google having to sort of split up and do some things that it definitely doesn't want to do.
Okay, tomorrow night, President Trump will join former Vice President Joe Biden and NBC's Kristen Welker in Nashville for the another debate. After the last one, there are going to be some pretty big changes, though. With the start of each segment, Welker will ask her first question, and one of them will have 2 minutes to provide a statement uninterrupted, with the other's mic cut. They're not saying whether the mics will be cut during the rebuttal periods, though, which leads me to wonder, Kathy, what is this going to ultimately accomplish over the last debate where there was all the crosstalk?
Well, you might actually get somebody to finish a sentence, which for the public would be a good thing, because you could actually find out what one candidate or the other actually intends to do. I think, what the big question I have in my own mind is to what extent were they inspired by the Saturday Night Live skit after the first debate that had the Joe Biden character with the mute button, which seemed to be pretty genius to me. And I wonder how much of that was like, hey, that's a pretty good idea Saturday Night Live had. I do think it's unfortunate that it really seems aimed at one particular candidate, but he brought it on himself.
Okay, so we're talking about Saturday Night Live. Last weekend, it was the West Wing stage show on HBO Max, the Aaron Sorkin drama about the trial of the Chicago 7 on Netflix, The Way I See It, the documentary profiling former White House chief photographer Pete Souza that was on MSNBC, and you can also get that on the Hulu Live and by this weekend on Peacock. This weekend, Amazon's got this.
Where is everybody? They want everybody to quarantine so they don't spread this virus. Could I stay in your home?
I hope quarantine never ends.
So I guess you could say Sacha Baron Cohen has been busy playing Abby Hoffman in the Chicago 7 movie and reprising his role in the sequel to Borat, which is on Amazon Prime this weekend. Ernest, there's been a really big push to get politically minded programming onto streaming services right now. I've been trying to think back going to 2000, and I've been so focused on covering elections in the days and weeks before them that I can't remember so much of the cultural touch points. Is this something we've been seeing in the 4-year cycles, or is this new this year?
No, I don't know if it's new, but you're seeing all of it all at the same time. It's almost as if everybody's like, we got to get it out now, because if we don't, we're probably going to lose this window. We won't have this opportunity again, so we're going to get it all out there now. And I think that's basically what you're seeing in this last 2 weeks. Anything that you could possibly do politically related is going to be out there, because once we get to November 4th, who knows what's going to happen.
So there's a piece on our links blog with everything that has come out and what will be coming out. Kathy, which ones have you watched so far?
None. Nothing could possibly compete with the reality TV that we've got. And I have to say, I never watched West Wing when it was on. And it's not that this is no diss to the show, but I just felt like if I got home and I had time to watch something on TV, I wanted to relax. And I will say this for West Wing.
How much of that was because you were in Washington in the early 2000s and you were living that life. You didn't need CJ Craig on your TV.
It felt like work. I mean, I will say the few snippets I saw, it was realistic enough that it felt like work. So yeah. I will compliment them, but I just thought I was on overload. Ernest, I don't know how many other Americans feel the same way.
Ernest, have you watched any of these yet?
I did watch the Sousa piece. It was and what really fascinated me about it was that the Reagan part, which I think most people would not have really known. I mean, I knew he was Reagan's photographer, but I didn't know the extent to which the access he was given, because most of what he talked about in this piece had never been discussed or never been shown. So that was really fascinating to me, the human side of Reagan that sort of came out in that piece, and then it moved into Obama, and you got to see some of that as well. So I thought it was pretty well done.
I watched that too, and I had conversations with both of my parents about it, and they were both very much touched by it, as was everybody I've talked to who've seen it. And there were two things that stuck out to me. The Reagan aspect of it that you described, and for two different reasons. One, the access and the way that he approached Reagan and covering Reagan in that way. But I think it also gave greater credibility maybe to some of the trolling he's been doing now against Trump, and showing how he had been that involved on covering a Republican president previously. The other point was how deeply it went into explaining the power of imagery and photojournalism, which is something that maybe wasn't as evident to people who maybe aren't in our profession. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about all of our topics on the Links blog at kbia.org. You can follow us on social media. We're on both Facebook and Twitter. Listen to our program, watch it again, send us questions, comments, see what we will be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Aaron Hay for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher composed our original theme music. I'm Amy Simons. You'll want to be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.